Excellent. So yeah, welcome to another CEN seminar. Thank you so much to Dr. Olivia Afonso for giving our talk today. Dr. Olivia Afonso is a senior lecturer in psychology at the Department of Psychology, Health and Professional Development at Oxford Brookes University, and she completed her PhD at the University of La Laguna in cognitive neuroscience and education. And her talk today will be on word writing, integral development and developmental dyslexia. So thank you so much. I share your screen and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Thank you very much for having me here. I hope that you will be seeing my slides now.
Yeah, that's great.
Good. Thank you, everybody that is not enjoying the nice weather to be here, hearing about word writing. My expertise is in spelling. Okay, so I will talk about different aspects of word written production, and I will be talking about the spelling processes that are more the linguistic processes. That is usually more my expertise. But you will see that we talk a lot about also the motor component of word written production. That will be the movements that are affected, that are involved in actually tracing something on a paper that somebody can come and read, right? And the reason for that, I think, it will become obvious during my presentation, but there is a close relationship between these two components of the task that are very different, but they affect each other, okay? I'm kind of assuming some knowledge of literacy research, but not massive. I think if somebody feels that I'm not making any sense, please, I'm very happy to be actually interrupted. So if somebody wants to ask something during the talk, I'm happy with that, okay? So, and I'm going to talk about word writing in typical development, so how we develop the ability to spell correctly and produce the movements that lead to a legible word in children with and without developmental dyslexia, but also with adults, okay? So I will have some research with adults with dyslexia and without dyslexia. Most of the research I will be talking today about has been conducted in collaboration with Fernando Cuetos and Paz Suarez Coay in the University of Oviedo in Spain. And they are mostly, so their specialism is mostly on reading difficulties in dyslexia. So they are more the experts on dyslexia, I would say, but we have done so many things together now that I think that we are blurring what they are the experts on and what I am the expert on. So, but yeah, mostly I will be talking about spelling difficulties in developmental dyslexia and how they affect writing and handwriting skills. Yes, I want to say something about other strands of my research that somebody has any interest. I won't be talking about today, but if somebody's interested in it, I will mention it at the end, so you can contact me by email and just have a chat about it, because I'm not sure what would be the interest of the people today. So spelling difficulties in dyslexia. We know that developmental dyslexia is mainly characterized by reading difficulties. But even the DSM characterized, when the dyslexia was included as an entry in the DSM, was characterized also by the spelling difficulties with written language. Okay, reading difficulties actually, spelling difficulties actually sometimes are more serious concerns for adult writers with dyslexia. So they seem to become a point in which reading difficulties ameliorate and spelling difficulties become the main concern, especially when the adults with dyslexia reach the university studies. They have to write a lot, they have to perform in exams, and they find this really a real barrier to academic achievement and progression. So it's a main concern that we hear from people with developmental dyslexia throughout the lifespan, but is particularly important for adults with dyslexia. Even if it's very prevalent and is very well known that these difficulties exist, reading difficulties have been in the spotlight for most of the research conducted in this area. Okay? But what do we talk about when we talk about spelling difficulties? Well, we talk about poor spelling. Okay, a lot of orthographic errors, misspellings are very common in both adults and children. But more sophisticated analysis of the written production have also shown that this leads to slow writing. Okay, they produce less text in a text production task. And also, if we measure, and most of my research today, I think all of my research today will be research I have conducted with digitizing tablets that measure the time that the writer needs to produce the whole word, but also interval between letters, between specific letters. So we have a very specific and very thorough idea of what is the process of writing, not only the product, which will be if it's correct or not. So when you analyze the process of writing and the chronometric measures of the production, so how quickly this word was produced, it's known that the students with dyslexia tend to be slow writers, not necessarily because they form the letters more slowly, but because they pause a lot between and for longer time. So they produce more pauses between letters, between words, and that these pauses are longer than those produced by peers without dyslexia. So as I was saying, it's very challenging, especially in adulthood. But the main thing that we wanted to generally address today is what is the nature of these difficulties? Why these spelling difficulties appear? What is the relationship with the reading difficulty? It's a consequence of the reading difficulty. Is a difficulty? Is a deficit that appears on top of the reading difficulty? What is the process that is affected that leads to poor spelling? What I mean by what is the process affected? Well, for this I had to talk a little bit about the normal spelling process. So when you want to spell a word, this is a very simplified version of what might happen if I ask you to spell to dictation a word. Okay, you might hear a word. Okay, and when you hear it, you have two options. Okay, maybe it's a word that you know how to spell, you have stored a lexical representation in long-term memory. So you can recognize a word and you have it in your mental dictionary, what we call the orthographic lexicon. So you can retrieve it as a whole. Okay, the spelling of this word is this one, and you will see it almost like a picture if you want. So you can retrieve from the lexicon if you know the word, if it's stored there, or maybe it's the first time that you see this word, or you haven't seen it enough times to memorize the spelling. Okay, so it's not in your lexicon. So you can do is to go this other route called also the sublexical route, in which you apply the phonology-to-orthography conversion rules allowed in your language. This means the rules that that your language has about which letters can be used to represent each specific sound or phoneme, okay, of a letter. So you can just segment the sound, the word that I have asked you to spell in individual phonemes, in individual sounds, and you say, okay, the first one is so that could be letter M according to English. It cannot be letter R. Okay, it's not legal to spell the sound in English with letter R. So that will an example of how you apply the rules that you have learned about how to link specific phonemes to specific graphemes. Okay, so this is what I mean with phonology-to-orthography conversion rules, phonology-to-orthography correspondences, or phoneme-to-grapheme correspondences. I will use these terms indistinctively. Okay, so you can use the sublexical route and generate a plausible spelling, something that could be the spelling of that, which you don't know because you are not sure, or you can just, I know the words retrieved from long-term memory. It's kind of a dual route of access to orthographic representations. Whatever the route that you follow to generate this spelling, you actually, when you write, you need to think that an adult, for example, can take 2 seconds to produce a word, which in cognitive processes is a lifetime, if you want. It's a very long process. So while you produce a letter, you need to keep in working memory the following letters, so you don't forget any of them, so you know in which order they have to be produced. So this is stored in a working memory system that is called orthographic working memory system. Maybe you have heard the term graphemic buffer that was used for a time in the literature too. So this will be a short-term memory system in which you keep these letters active while you produce them. Okay. Okay. So what do we know about these systems? Okay, these are things that, and then you produce the movements, okay? What we call the peripheral processes of motor processes. You need to know how to form the letters. What do we know about this system? Well, we know the lexicon is sensitive to the frequency of the words. So you will retrieve words from the lexicon very quickly if they are very frequent to you. You have seen them many times. If they are not very frequent, you haven't seen them many times, it will take you longer to retrieve them in the lexicon. So the word, the lexical root is sensitive to word frequency. If you are going to apply the phonology-to-orthography correspondences, actually, frequency, it won't be an issue for you, okay? You will be sensitive to if the spelling is regular or irregular, because you will be trying to sounding out the segments. So if it's something irregular, you might produce something that is wrong, because usually what you will do is just to go with the letter that most commonly represent that sound. If it's irregular, you will get it wrong, okay? So frequency of the word is not affected because you don't know, you recognize the word. But if you follow the lexical route, irregularity doesn't matter too much to you because you know the word. You have retrieved it as a whole word, so the regularity is not a problem. You will retrieve the word as a whole word. And then orthographic working memory, as all working memory systems, what we know about them is that they are very sensitive to length. Okay, so if the word is very long, it might be that you have problems retrieving of the letters. It might be that you skip one. It's more likely that you forget one. Okay, if you have working memory problems, long words are problematic for you. Short words might be okay because they are not that much of a challenge. Long words will be very difficult for you. So basically what I do in my research is trying to investigate. Here's some references in which I have some support for these claims, okay, in which we, with other collaborators, have published evidence that we use these roots when we spell. The degree in which you use these roots might depend on the language that you are writing in. So if your language is transparent, it's more opaque, it will affect how much do you rely on them. But we have evidence to show that adult writers, skilled writers will use a little bit of both types of information all the time. So you want to read about that. So more things that we know is that, yeah, this seems to be, so what we call, this is what I call the central processes, the linguistic processes, how you access the spelling, okay, and affects letters and relatively abstract representations. And as I said, after that, you have to engage with the motor processes. So you just retrieve the hand movements to produce the letters, okay? Very different things to do, but what we know is that they interact, okay? That means that there are different theories explaining how or why they interact, okay? Why more difficulty in the linguistic aspects of writing lead to slower handwriting or more less fluent handwriting, and why, if you have motor difficulties, spelling might suffer, okay? There are different mechanisms that you can propose why this happens. Just mention some of them. Van Galen created a very influential model of handwriting, and what he said is like, well, spelling is happening at the same time that peripheral processes, so they but they are dealing with different units. What this means is, if when you are writing a word physically, okay, when you are producing the motor patterns for a word, you probably are retrieving the spelling of the next word that you are going to write. So central processes and motor processes happen at the same time, but not necessarily about the same word or about the same segment, but they compete for resources. They are all just training your resources. Another thing that has been proposed is that you start writing as soon as you know something about the spelling. So you have decided that you know the spelling of the beginning of the word, so you start the motor processes, but central processes continue to be engaged because you haven't decided yet how to spell the end of it, for example. So central means that you will have effects on your speed of handwriting just because you are still engaged in linguistic processes. So it's difficult to isolate these two things. And this is important. Why? Because if you have a spelling difficulty, you might be a slow writer. It might be just because of spelling difficulty and not because you have motor problems. And for a practitioner, it might be difficult, or a teacher, it might be difficult to know, does this child have spelling difficulties and motor difficulties? And I need to engage in motor training or motor interventions. or it's just a consequence of the spelling difficulties, and if spelling improves, motor difficulties will disappear. It was just a case of just doing everything at the same time. So this is one of the main things why this is important. But in my case, in the case of my talk, this is important because I measure sometimes the effects of spelling difficulties just by measuring handwriting, because I know the handwriting will suffer if a spelling is difficult. So the main aim of my research is to investigate which of these levels of processing are causing the spelling difficulties that we see in dyslexia. Is a problem of lexical access? Is a problem of sublexical access? Is there a problem with working memory? Okay, and there are previous evidence that actually supported all of these claims. So different previous researchers have claimed that spelling difficulties in dyslexia could be attributed to any of these processes. Okay, so it is well known that the deficit in reading is usually attributed to phonological deficits. So many authors thought, well, there's a problem just identifying phonemes and to actually learning the phonology-to-orthography correspondences, because there is a phonological deficit. There's a deficit involved in identification of phonemes, manipulation of phonemes. Some evidence to support this is that writers with dyslexia tend to produce more phonologically non-plausible errors than people without dyslexia in percentage. That means they have a disproportionate amount of errors that are not pronounced like the target word, okay? This means they are not producing something that could be the spelling because it's pronounced the same, okay? It's just something that could not be, so it's read completely different. This seems to indicate that they are not actually correctly applying, that phoneme could be the grapheme, okay? The rules of the language, they are applying something different. However, some authors have shown evidence that seems to be more consistent with a lexical impairment. So problems storing words in long-term memory, to have lexical representations. So some authors have found that there is lexical learning deficits, and there is also to be an over-reliance on phonology-to-orthography correspondences. So it's very difficult to spell irregular words, for example. And the working memory impairment hasn't been explored in that much detail, but working memory difficulties have been associated many times with dyslexia. They are present, so poor working memory is reported very often in assessment of people with dyslexia, and some is very common, anecdotally, because I don't think this has been properly studied. It's very common that participants with dyslexia produce the typical error that is most commonly associated to errors with working memory, which is skipping a letter, transposing letters, changing the order a little bit. This is anecdotally a very common error in dyslexia. That is not very common in people without dyslexia. To transpose letters, for example, that doesn't happen very often when you are handwriting. And this seems to be problems identifying which letter is next, just forgetting some of them, okay? Which could actually explain the non-phonologically plausible errors. If you forget a letter, obviously it's not going to sound the same as the word that you were presented, okay? So yes, what I do in my research is just to manipulate these three variables that we know that are a reflection of the use of these three the components of the spelling system. So I manipulate word frequency, consistency, or regularity of the spelling, and the length of the words to see if they affect in the same way both the latency of the response, so the time that participants need to start writing the word, which I take that is a measure of spelling processes, so therefore that you need to come up with the spelling, and the duration of the word, and usually even the duration between letters, okay? And I compare this between a control group without dyslexia and a group with developmental dyslexia. And I will present data for adults and children, as I said. But The first studies that we'll talk about, they all follow more or less the same manipulation, okay? I have the manipulation, these are the Spanish examples because these are Spanish children, in which you have, we orthogonally manipulate the consistency, the length, and the frequency, right? And you have high frequency words that are short and that are completely consistent. There's only one potential spelling if you apply phonology to orthography. And the other ones have a segment that is inconsistent. So B, the sound, that sound B in Spanish can be spelled with letter B or with letter V. In Spanish, they both sound the same. So they have this kind of segments, and we see, so you need lexical, you need to know the word to spell it correctly, because actually the frequency of these two segments is usually 50%. And we have different tasks just to see if the task affected, how quickly you can produce the task. So what happens when you see orthography, right? So we have a copying task. I'm going to report data from a copying task. Just they have to copy the word, and the dictation task, in which they have to spell the dictation that they hear. And they see, this is an example of the copy task. They see the word, they have the tablet in front of them, they have to write it very quickly. For adults, we ask that they are writing in uppercase letters. So we have the interval, and then they click in a button and see the next one. And they do this for a couple of minutes, for 25 minutes, that means. They are not very long experiments. And then we have specific software that give us information about the chronometric measures of the production, right? So we all obviously have, is the spelling correct or incorrect? We can see that in the product, but we also have information about the latencies that give us information about speed of access to orthographic representation, the whole word writing duration. This is what I will report for children, because children in our experiments are asked to write in lowercase, so they don't produce intervals between letters. So I will measure the whole thing. Sometimes what we do is to measure a specific segment. If we say, okay, this segment is the same in the two words, I'm just going to measure that one to have the same sequence of letters, for example, SA, in a high frequency word versus a low frequency word. And the interletters intervals. This was particularly interesting for us for irregularities. So we have, we thought that if you have to resolve a irregularity that comes, you probably will produce a longer pass just before that, if you're resolving it during the process of writing. So that's why this measure is very valuable for us. Children, this is the examples that I give you, like what our children with dyslexia did. So we tested 60 Spanish speakers, 60 Spanish speakers that with a mean age of 9.7. This is the chronological age match group, which it has the same, is the peers for, they are in the same class than our students with developmental dyslexia, but they don't have dyslexia. And a reading age group. This is a group that has the same reading level that the group with dyslexia in a reading test, but they are younger because they have been matched by the reading age and not by the and yet we ask them to do these two tasks and measure what I have just mentioned, just the duration of the response, the written latencies, and the accuracy of the response. Just very quickly, because I don't want to make a fuss about all of this, there are a little bit too much data here. Just want to call your attention about the similarities with the other two groups, okay? This is the group with developmental dyslexia in the center, and then here you have people with the same age, children, younger children have the same reading age. And this is the latency, this is the time that you need to start writing since you see or hear the word, okay? Here I think I have presented everything together. It's very interesting that you have significant, and what I'm plotting here, the three graphs is the frequency, the difference for, in black, we have high frequency words, consistent words, words that are completely consistent, and long words, okay? Compared to low frequency words, inconsistent words, or short words, okay? So what we found is that all the groups have a frequency effect. Everybody takes longer to start writing infrequent words. That's expected. So our frequency manipulation is successful. There is a significant difference in the size of this effect. Is higher in the group with developmental dyslexia, but compared to the group with the same age without dyslexia. However, the size of this effect is completely the same as the younger children with the same reading ability. It's exactly the same. Even the duration of the latencies is the same. So children with the same reading age will take as much longer to start writing. For the consistency effect, we have that the group without dyslexia, the older group with dyslexia, the peers without dyslexia, didn't have any consistency effect. We think this is because they are writing lexically, so they are retrieving the word. Oh, the word is this one, so it doesn't matter if it's very regular or irregular. I know this word, write it quickly. Again, the group with developmental dyslexia is much lower, but also has a longer effect of consistency, a greater effect of consistency. So inconsistent words are particularly problematic. But this is exactly the same pattern that you find with children with the same reading ability. And the length effect is also it's not significant in the group without dyslexia or the same age, but is more or less the same for group with dyslexia, and so more time to start writing longer words, which for the copy makes sense because the input is longer, right? In any case, we find evidence of problems with the three things, okay? So in the sense of deficits in comparison with children of the same age attending the same class that don't have dyslexia, they have more problems with inconsistent, low frequent and long words. All of this is consistent with the reading ability. It seems to be related with the level of reading ability more than anything else, okay? Interestingly, the writing duration is the duration of the handwriting, okay? So what we have here is the three groups. And what we find is that the younger group without dyslexia, okay, the one that has the same reading ability, is much slower writing. But the group with dyslexia is not necessarily slower at writing. It's equally quick as the group with dyslexia. So this is not apparently a motor problem. There's no problem of handwriting speed, okay? However, they show a longer effect of length in the duration. And the duration we measure a specific particular segment of the word and compare it in between long words and short words. And these segments are longer if you have longer words, okay? So this effect is longer in the group with dyslexia and reading ability. And the same group with reading ability. Said, but speed is the pattern is very common with a group with it doesn't seem to be apparently a great difficulty in motor processes. Okay, what happens when we do exactly the same experiment with very highly educated adults? Okay, in this case, it doesn't make sense to have a reading ability group because you will be comparing people that are studying for their PhD with adolescents. So they are very different in many different other ways. So just compare with the group with the same age without dyslexia. I want to call your attention to the number of years in education, in formal education, very high. So these are everybody who was studying for a degree. None of them were in the first year, they were in the second year or higher of the degree. We have PhD students here, or people with already a PhD actually. So a lot of contact with written language during the lifetime. So they have read a lot during this time because they have been studying a lot, okay? What we found in this case is that even if they still are slow at starting writing, even after 16 years in formal education, these people are still takes more time to start writing words. Okay, words like some of them are really frequent. They take more time, and they have a higher effect of frequency, so a bigger effect of frequency. So low frequency words are still very, very challenging. Long words are more challenging than in the group without dyslexia. So this difference is higher. But no difference in the size of the effect of consistency. So what we think is, this is Spanish, okay? They are very simple phonology-to-orthography conversion rules to learn. So I think after all this time in contact with the language, any deficit that the children with dyslexia has been overcome with time. So it has disappeared in adulthood. They apply phonology-to-orthography conversion rules equally well as somebody without dyslexia. However, difficulties accessing the lexicon, or maybe poor lexicon, not many words are stored in the lexicon, persist, and also difficulties with long string of letters persist. So it seems to be a working memory deficit that persists with age and with increased contact with written language. Yes, some comparisons between tasks that shows that the differences between the two groups with and without dyslexia is always, and this happens always with adults, is always bigger in the copying task. And we think that this is the two things put together. So if you have the deficit on copying, you are slower because you are copying, you have to read, and that takes you longer. And then you are slower at writing. So now you are doubly slow. So we recommend to the teachers that if this is a task that requires speed from the children with dyslexia, maybe giving them something to copy is not the best idea, because even if it might be that it's helpful just to give them the model so they don't have to think about the spelling, if they are going to be comparing speed or with their peers, the difference will be only more striking. So writing deficits associated with developmental dyslexia vary with the age. A deficit in phonological and the application of phonology-to-orthography conversion rules appears in young writers, but then disappears if you have very frequent contact with language. There seems that the deficits are better explained as a deficit in spelling acquisition related with the poor level of reading. It may kind of make sense that if you don't read enough, you don't read sufficiently well, you create fewer long-term representations in lexicon. So this might be related. As I said, deficit in the lexical root seems to be, at least in Spanish, I don't know in English, with more complicated phonology-to-orthography conversion rules, if we will find the same, and this is something that we are doing at the moment. There doesn't seem to be difficulties in handwriting speed. I didn't show you this, but I show you that the children were not slower handwriters than their peers, okay? The children with dyslexia. However, the adults were slower at handwriting compared to the peers without dyslexia. So this difference in actual movement duration became evident only for adults. And this is important for the next thing I'm going to talk about. So what we thought is like, oh, maybe this happens because when we test the children, the group with the same chronological age, they are not very quick either. You know, they haven't become very quick at writing either. So you don't find differences with the group without dyslexia because writing hasn't become too automatic. But in adulthood, the people without dyslexia have become very fast writers, have automatized the handwriting, and then is when you can see actually a difference between the two groups. And because we wanted to test how handwriting difficulties might appear from the spelling difficulties, we tested again 60 Spanish children, different children, a little bit older. This is important. Our previous group was have an age of 9.5, something like that. These are 10, 11, 12. And we asked them to do the copying task, the spelling to dictation task, and 2 graphic tasks. An alphabet writing task is they have to write the alphabet very quickly, and these 2 graphic tasks, okay, in which they have to trace these labyrinths to take the pet to their foot, and they have to cross these in these concentric circles. They have to cross it in the middle, okay, as fast as they can during 1 minute. So what we found is that children with dyslexia were only slower when you compare long words to short words, okay? That means with short words, they manage to be as quick as children without dyslexia. But when you make the words longer and more difficult, you see that they struggle with the speed. Interestingly, they were also slower when with the two graphic tasks, the circles and the labyrinths, which are not completely non-linguistic. So there's no component of language in any of these two tasks, and they trace this more slowly. More or less the same as the children with the same reading level. So what we think is that spelling difficulties affect handwriting speed, but only these are evident only when other children have already progressed. So what we think that is happening here, and this is a little bit speculative, what it might be happening is that children without spelling difficulties handwrite more words more quickly because they are not struggling, and more fluently. They can practice more fluently because they can write, they do less pauses between letters, for example. So they, and also they probably engage more in writing, because if you have dyslexia and you find spelling very difficult, maybe handwriting is not your favorite activity in the world. Maybe they write less for pleasure, if that makes sense to you. So this reduced practice and this reduced fluency that they achieve during handwriting, it might affect the development of other graphic skills that are not linguistic, like tracing and crossing. So it will be, I'm bad at spelling, I don't like to handwrite, I don't handwrite enough. Handwriting contributes to developing the hand movement skills that are associated to other tasks, so you also become slower at other graphic tasks. So this highlights for us the importance to not see the deficits like additive things. You have a deficit on this and this and this. It might be the only deficit that these children have to begin with is related with spelling memorization, reading, and the storage and long-term memory of words. This has a domino effect that affects a lot of skills that they are learning and that they improve with the reading skill. Yeah, we found impairments. Copying is very demanding. It seems to improve writing plus reading difficulties. On the plus side, just want to highlight that this gives us some useful information that can be used in the class. Just try to avoid tasks that have the two components involved, if speed is a thing that is going to be important. There are phonology correspondences deficits to begin with, but if there is enough contact with language, with written language, and you are exposed to language frequently, those difficulties will improve. There will be persistent orthographic lexicon difficulties, particularly with low frequency words, but it might be that if you are exposed more to language, you will reduce the size of this effect. And orthographic working memory deficit seems to also persist. But it might be we are working with the possibility that we are trying to investigate the possibility that you can use your spare phonological orthographic correspondences once they are to the same level of children without disabilities, without dyslexia, to actually hold more effectively representation of orthographic working memory, so to just verbalize the words, just to try to keep them in working memory. And yes, reduced handwriting speed becomes more apparent with age. So everybody becomes quicker, and they seem not to develop this skill. And this might be affecting graphic speed development too. And this is something we need to explore more, and just not to test the children with dyslexia only on reading and only on linguistic tasks, because some other things might not benefit from the benefits of learning to read quickly. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, we're happy to answer.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Olivia. That was really interesting. We've got a bit of time, which is fantastic. So if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the chat or feel free to unmute and ask away. I suppose while everyone's thinking, I will use my routine. Ask a question. So that's quite interesting. You're talking about different languages and you're working on like English as opposed to Spanish now, but I was also wondering if you think you'd find the same results. So this is for the first part of your study, looking at like latency and handwriting length. You mentioned that a lot of your participants who had dyslexia were doing undergrads or postgrads or PhDs. Do you think you'd find the same results with a more what's the like public's more generalizable sample, or do you think that's specific to the sample that you were using?
Yes, thank you, Lucy. So for the results with the adults, I will expect that will change. So as I said, it's difficult to know until we don't test these populations. As I said, with English, what we suspect is that phonology-to-orthography correspondence difficulties last longer in English speakers, for example, because there's more to learn, more difficult, they are more complex, there are so many irregularities. So if you are not exposed to sufficient, this is what we think, is like if you are not exposed to the fact that I need to link phonemes with graphemes very frequently, it might be that these difficulties will linger for longer and longer. This needs to be tested, of course. But yeah, I will expect that if some children, because they don't have the opportunity or because they really are demotivated about reading, they just stop just trying to decode, difficulties are going to get. So the differences with peers without dyslexia is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And yeah, it's going to be difficult for them to catch up. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. Any questions from our audience for Olivia? I've got one in the chat I'll read out. Would you expect to see any difference in general spontaneous drawing ability between your CA and your developmental dyslexia group, say level of complexity or details?
Well, that's very interesting. We are looking at, thank you for the question. We are looking at fluency, about whether the traces are well, because we are looking at only a speed, but we don't know if the traces are better form or not. I don't know anything about drawing, but I know that some of my students are interested in doing something like that, that they haven't done anything with dyslexia, but it's definitely a question, because we expect that if they have not a specific practice with tracing letters, that affects the ability to trace something else. So yeah, probably they might become less fluent and worse at drawing tracing. It might be, but and it's interesting because I think that there is a lot of reported evidence that is conflicting, like children with dyslexia are worse at this or this, or sometimes are better, but if it depends a little bit on what you do to come. So you don't like reading, but maybe you decide that you are going to love drawing and you get a lot of practice drawing. I wouldn't expect those children to have these difficulties because they have acquired this experience with tracing in a different way. But if maybe they decide that they are not going to touch a pencil ever again, then this might affect. So yeah, I don't know if you have any example in mind, Chris, about
No, I don't. I just have heard the same kinds of things that you just mentioned, that maybe if somebody doesn't like reading, they tend towards art school and expressing themselves differently. And of course, it'd be very difficult to analyze the kind of drawing they're doing, but perhaps the way they display physical relationships in portrait drawing, or do they tend towards cartooning? I just thought it was interesting. Part of my program is an arts integration program, and that's one of the things they always suggest, but I'm really here just because I teach a literacy and numeracy course, so it's a little different. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, but yeah, it's interesting. And the digitizing tablets give opportunity to see all of these things. So if somebody has interest, I recommend just trying to use these tablets to get more data about that, because it's a good tool.
Yeah, the point about suggesting that teachers not use copying exercises is really important, because teachers always want, applications of this kind of material. And that's one of the first things I think is helping. And that would be a very good example of something that they should really think more about before they give the handout or write on the board for the students to copy. So that was a very interesting detail. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, we have a couple more questions. One from Paul, who is asking, with bilingual children, are they equally dyslexic in both languages? Which I think is an interesting question.
This is very interesting. Very, very, we don't know. I will contact you in the number of years that will take us to analyze the data that we are collecting. So we are trying now to see more data from children in Spain that they are being taught in both languages. So they are in bilingual schools, so they are fluent in both languages. So there is a lot of research on bilingualism, but research on biliteracy, so being able to write in both of them, is quite more recent. I'm sure that everybody has heard about bilingualism. Biliteracy is not that commonly present, because there was a time in which when you were a bilingual, you don't necessarily know how to spell very well or write very well in both of those languages. There is one that is more conversational and one is, so there is not a lot of knowledge about that, but there is interesting research that shows that you learn probably there is a period of time in which you probably all the languages that you have seen, you start creating like a one orthographic system. Everything is the same for you. You don't have separate system at the beginning. So you might use things that are legal in Spanish that you have seen in Spanish books when you are writing in English. So young children will do that. There is a point in which they separate. But this is not specifically. So I think that there will be a point in which they might be, at the beginning, you might struggle with both things. I would say that you will struggle with both, in the sense that if you have a problem of creating long-term memory representations of words in memory, just to memorizing words, that is going to affect both languages. However, memorizing words is more important in English than in Spanish, because in Spanish you use the phonology-to-orthography route, and nobody will notice. So yeah, I expect similar deficits that are going to have different consequences. But yeah, we need to investigate more on that. Thank you for the question.
That's great. Thank you so much. Another question from Michael Thomas. He's asking, how homogeneous or heterogeneous do you think individuals in the DD label, so the developmental dyslexia label, are? Could they have different combinations of deficits, so more peripheral or central, which lead to similar looking behavior impairments? And in that context, how would you interpret different patterns of comorbidity with writing difficulties, for example, of attention or math difficulties?
Well, that's I love that question, because it's basically one of the most recent things, thank you very much, that we are looking at is like, we know that there are different profiles. We know that there was a time in which everybody used these different terms, like phonological dyslexia or lexical dyslexia. It's like you have more problems with the lexical part. You have more, this is from the tradition of reading. In spelling, I think we haven't realized too much about this. We have now created some secondary, based on our samples, secondary analysis, just trying to separate between those that produce more phonological plausible errors, that seems to be using the phonology-to-orthography because they don't have many lexical representations, so they just try to produce something that is plausible, and others that seem to be producing things that actually don't sound like the word, that it seems to be like they have problems with the phonology-to-orthography correspondences. We have separated those two profiles, and interestingly, slow writing, slow pauses, and things. But we have very little data about this, so just don't take this. It's indicative of what it can be. Only those that have the phonological deficit show the slow writing. And this is interesting. I mean, I don't know if there's anybody here that knows, but I mean, it's very recent research, but in the writing literature in general, there are more and more evidence to show that phonological processes affect writing more than lexical processes. It seems the lexical processes are higher up. They don't reach the motor processes, if that makes sense. But if your deficit is phonological processing, that is a little bit later, then it might affect your handwriting. So we are really keen on analyzing more this data and get more data from more different participants with different profiles to see if we can confirm that in maybe these motor difficulties that sometimes appear, sometimes don't, appear only when you have a specific profile of dyslexia. So yes, thank you. That makes sense.
That's great. And I think, yeah, we've gotten I think one more. If there's any more, please do pop them in the chat. But from Melissa, who's asking, what's the best way for kids in high school who are dyslexic and have trouble writing notes? What's the best way for them to get notes?
Oh, yes. Well, there's another big one, because we have here, it's not my expertise, but we have colleagues here working on typing and dyslexia. Because you're probably thinking about, there is the recommendation about like doing the exams by typing, because you can have a spell check, we understand this. The thing is that if all these problems with slow handwriting appear for the spelling, it doesn't. So it doesn't. So because they have to do the two things at the same time. An adolescent with dyslexia are going by default, all of them are going to find spelling difficult. I will recommend whatever method is the child is more comfortable, is quicker at. So it's more automatic for them. If they find handwriting fuzzy because they have been using computers forever, since they were born basically, and they actually are more fluent, whatever it takes less resources from the spelling. So if spelling and motor processes have to compete for the resources, one is like, okay, do whatever is easier for you at the motor, so you concentrate in what you find difficult. So I think we are trying to just like one size fits all, and everybody, like what they should do is like whatever is, so typing very challenging, some of them will be touch typers, some of consuming. So whatever is easier for that.
Excellent. Any more questions? And also apologies if my Wi-Fi, I've got some Wi-Fi issues, so apologies if I'm cutting out at all. I think we've lost Olivia. I don't know where. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. And hopefully see you next week at the CEN seminar series. Thank you.